start talking about the awards competition. Just give me your take on the jury deliberation process and how did that go and what were all of the inputs?
It was really interesting because our jury was from different parts of the world, and so each of us had our own experience with particular buildings that were in the pool. But what's amazing is, you know, as we debated them and talked about them, there was incredible commonality in things that we thought were important. How each building dealt with environment issues, the way the buildings met the ground and the public spaces of the building, how those buildings were integrated into their contexts. We did have conversations about tall, and in other words, you know, when we got down to weighing one building versus another, you know, it actually did come up like that one was taller than the other. But I think at the end we agreed that, you know, the building's height, these are all tall buildings already, and some buildings seem taller in their particular context than others. So we tended to move away from that criteria in terms of like this one's taller so it's better or gets more points. At least, you know, as I was the jury chair, that's how it went.
Well, and you raise a good point because in recent years, you know, the tallest building was not always the award winner, actually far from it. And of course it is tall buildings and urban habitat.
Right.
But for the best tall building award, you don't see that as being a problem.
No, I don't. I think that, you know, it's not going to, these finalists are stellar buildings of all the different regions. It's not going to come down to which one is the tallest. I really don't think so.
Moving right along here, your own practice, are there any new markets for skyscraper work that are beginning to open up? What are you looking at?
I think what I've seen that I think is the biggest change is that tall buildings are just becoming so normalized. And in other words, I'm working currently on a residence hall at a university, and even one today was awarded, or the tree house was a residence hall that was a tall building. So new typologies are beginning to become tall buildings. It's becoming more normal to make a tall building that's a school, that's a hospital. You know, this is really remarkable because when CTBUH first started, I think probably most of the buildings were usually corporate headquarters or commercial buildings. Mm-hmm. And so we're seeing it spread and proliferate, and that is because of demand, you know, on space, urban space, and the transformation of populations becoming more urban.
One of my favorite topics is the kind of cultural manifestations of you know, the vision of height in other cultures, and certainly buildings in China don't look like buildings in Chicago. Any observations on that? Is there really that much of a difference, and are the lines starting to blur?
There is still a difference. You know, as a designer, I can see why some of the buildings look the way they do in the U.S. market because of the pressures and the different criteria that are more important here, say, than in Asia. For example, in the U.S. market, the speed at which the building can be constructed is very crucial. You see buildings coming up. There's a lot of effort focused on how can you reduce the construction time, and that is somewhat visible in the designs. In Asia, I think there's still a desire to have symbolic meaning in the tall buildings, and that weighs out over some of the other demands. So there's more, I'd say, more symbolic expression still in some of the Asian designs. I think in the Middle East, you're seeing a higher degree of sensitivity to climate now, and not just pure glass. There are a number of buildings that are starting to incorporate solid walls with more insulation in that harsh climate. So overall, generally the level is getting more mature, and there are more subtle responses to each of the climates, which I think is a good thing.
We've seen two very different takes on tall buildings in the last conferences in England and then in Shanghai. And the manifestation of height in Asia is kind of their take on it is part of it is the lighting. Just spectacular lighting in all of these
Yes.
Asian cities. Is that something that you would like to work with?
That's a very good question. Lighting on tall buildings, and it's sometimes called vanity lighting, as with the top of the buildings that are called the vanity tops of the buildings, which I think is meant to talk about the decorative quality of the building top and how it meets the sky. Sure, it's interesting to think about that top of the building and its profile on the skyline, and of course at night lighting is something that accentuates that. One of the things that's my particular interest in tall buildings is probably very particular in the group that we're in today is how these buildings are, their cumulative impact on the environment. And so lighting is actually a very sensitive piece. I don't think we fully understand it yet. But for example, night lighting on buildings can have a detrimental impact on migrating birds and on wildlife. So I would love to understand that more, and we've been doing some work and research with ornithologists and others to try to understand the impact of lighting of cities in general and skyscrapers on other populations, not just people, but also the environment around us, the birds that fly through at night and through migration. So lighting is beautiful, it's interesting, but I want to know more about the science of how it impacts the environment.
I'm going to read one of their questions here, and I'm just going to read it verbatim.
Okay.
And given that CTBUH is the arbiter of building height, we often get asked if the pursuit of height is testosterone driven. As you now have one of the most prominent tall buildings of the last decade in your portfolio, what is your view on that? And is this a silly question that needs to be put to rest? Because I've heard that a lot too.
Okay, everyone has testosterone, and we just have different amounts of it. And I see the world as a continuum. There's feminine and masculine, and there's everything in between. And the same with environment. The world is one big continuum. So, I have some testosterone too, and I like to see tall buildings. But luckily, I've always remarked it in my office. It's actually true that once we start getting into the design, we start looking at that height and asking ourselves, what if it were 2 or 3 more stories, we would actually hit the super tall mark. So I think it's something that's more human than necessarily purely male, as a desire to go high and an urge to make a mark on the world that maybe breaks a boundary, breaks a record. There's something exciting about that on every level.
Well, considering all of the discussion we've heard over the years about the tall building being the ultimate male expression, is super tall design, is that empowering for you? Is that something that you're particularly interested in? Is that for everybody?
I am interested in it. I am. I think it's, the thing about it is it's a challenge to make a city more dense and at the same time more compelling to live there. But I think it goes hand in hand with shrinking the footprint of the city. I'm not just interested in tall buildings just for the sake of doing it. It has to do with, making a planet that can be sustained and that only works if you also rein in the edges of the city and try to get the transportation, the jobs, everything in a compact but livable and compelling footprint that we can maybe de-accession, the area around it and preserve some of our really important resources on the planet.
And I'll read this one verbatim again too. Do you think the entrance into the field of some design-centric firms that have not worked in skyscrapers previously, and they offer Hudson Yards as an example, portends anything? And do you feel like the success of Aqua Tower might have something to do with that?
I wouldn't say Aqua Tower has something to do with that. I don't know if the answer to that, but what I do know is I think that, as I said, we see height creeping into all different kinds of typologies now. We see it proliferating in cities, and there's something around 500 tall buildings being constructed right now on the globe. So there's going to naturally be more talent brought in to address this demand. And I, for one, am very thankful to see that being opened up to people, to younger designers and people that have new ideas, and to just really wrestle that stranglehold that has been on the design of tall buildings, and wrestle it free and open it up to a lot wider group of talented architects.